Now, as we begin to awaken, our identity begins to shift. As we let go of one way of seeing ourselves, we awaken to a new way of seeing ourselves, a new way of being, literally a new consciousness. So very often in our first real spiritual awakening, what we see is that we're not ego, that we're not the person we thought we were. Ego may still be there. It may not just simply disappear with that recognition, but if the awakening is true and it's authentic, it's in some way or another that we've really realized that we're not the person we thought we were. That is a fundamental shift of identity. Generally, when people have a first awakening, very often what they've really awoken from is their ego. They haven't necessarily awoken from self as such, but they've awoken to lower self, which would be ego. Which is an amazing realization, which is extraordinary, liberating thing to experience and to see. And it's at that very point, and especially after spiritual awakening, that it becomes even more important to really know what the orientation of a spiritual teaching is. Because it's very easy to forget that the path, if you can even call it a path, but the teaching that leads to real awakening is about the surrendering of self. When one has a moment of spiritual clarity, a moment of spiritual awakening, very often at some point after that, the ego will come and try to grab hold of it again. And as soon as ego tries to grab hold of that which is beyond itself, we experience that our realization seems to disappear, that the aperture that opened up very vast and wide in a moment of spiritual clarity starts to close and seems to disappear. But this is simply because mind, or ego, is grasping at realization. Again, the ego will always tend to grasp at what's pleasurable, of what it likes, of what it's trying to sustain. Unfortunately, in spirituality, when ego grasps at a truth, it actually obscures that truth. So if ego starts to grasp at a spiritual realization, at a moment of spiritual clarity, then that view, the openness of the view of awakening will tend to close down, simply because ego is grasping. And that's because the whole orientation of spiritual awakening is letting go of self. And as soon as self comes back in and tries to gain control, tries to dominate, tries to have its own way, then the consciousness will tend to shrink back down to a smaller sense of identity. So it becomes more and more and more vital. The deeper your own realization goes, it becomes more vital, not less, that you have an understanding of what the basic spiritual orientation is, that it's actually a surrender of self. This becomes more important because the more open you get, the more clear you get, the illusion and the workings of self become more and more subtle and more transparent, and therefore they become harder and harder to spot, to notice. The oneself can actually wear very, very spiritually looking clothing, you might say. Ego or self can appear in lots of different spiritual guises, and it's very easy to get tripped up on them. There is warnings throughout all of the mystical literature of different traditions about not grasping at realization, at revelation, not grasping at the temptations of freedom. Because with freedom, as long as self is there, that freedom will come with temptations for the self to aggrandize itself with your own realization. So there's many ways that it's easy to become lost in the domain of self's attempt to become something again, to reestablish itself. And because there are these inherent stumbling blocks in spirituality, it's very important to have a deep understanding, an ever-growing understanding of what spirituality is all about, that it's the surrender of self. Now, as I said, most spiritual awakenings, they often feel like you've completely obliterated self, that there is no self there anymore, that there is no ego there. But more often than not, ego and self will reestablish itself or try to reestablish itself for some time.